The first humans were quite unlike humans today. Humans today have societies with 8 things. Neolithic humans were nomads who mainly hunted for food. Until one day, some guy stuck a seed in the ground and it made him food. This was the beginning of farming. So the nomads got tired of walking and stayed in one place so they could farm. Usually they stayed in a river valley, such as the Nile, Tigris and Euphrates, Huanghe and Huangzi, and the Indus River Valley. Rivers were full of hunting game and, water, plus the farming was better because the rivers would flood over. Now the river civilizations have become more powerful. They are Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus River Valley Civilization, and China. Mesopotamia was a very powerful civilization. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were the bodies of water that kept them alive. This area was called the Fertile Crescent due to the shape it makes between the rivers. The rivers overflowed often, so their soil was quite fertile. But the floods kind of made a mess, so they invented dikes and channels to control these floods. The floods probably inspired the made-up story of a flood that destroyed the world in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Irrigation ditches helped keep the soil fertile all over the land. They had a class system, and all the people who lived there were polytheistic. They worshipped their gods in ziggurats and invented cuneiform. The people who lived in Mesopotamia were smart too, dividing an hour into 60 minutes and a circle into 360 degrees. The ruler, Hammurabi, was called the lawgiver. He was obsessed with eyes for some reason, but he made civil laws that protected the powerless. Egypt was not only powerful, but they were also pretty rich. Egypt was located by the Nile River, and their history is split into 3 kingdoms: the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. In the Old Kingdom, the pharaoh rose to power, but when they die, they are put into pyramids, which are these alien-looking buildings that were very sacred. They believed a human needed to earn eternal life. They were polytheistic too. But then, in the Middle Kingdom, foreign invaders came and kind of messed everything up. Let's just say that time was turbulent. The New Kingdom is where Egypt really centered its power as a large civilization. It stretched all the way to the Euphrates River, in fact. The pharaohs became very powerful. Some were even women, but the most powerful was Ramses II. Under his reign, Egypt stretched down to Syria. Egypt had a writing system that used hieroglyphics, and they sometimes carved them into stone and other times wrote them on papyrus. The Indus River Valley is located in the northern part of India, and there is a giant Deccan sticking out the bottom of the continent. However, that area is sparsely populated due to the infertile soil. The monsoon brings in much of the water needed to water their crops. The most prominent and populated cities were the Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. They had a well-organized government and social class system. They were polytheistic, and Vedas prayers were memorized and recited. The Iran civilization lived in the Ganges, and they were also polytheistic, and the gods embodied the natural forces. By 1750, the Indus River Valley civilization had disappeared, and nobody knows why to this day. China is located by the Huanghe and Huangzi rivers that would flood with yellow silt and cause mass destruction. They were surrounded by high mountains, deserts, and jungles. They were isolated but still had contact with outside peoples. Shang gained power in China until 1027 BC. They had complex religious beliefs with nature spirits, and they believed in the ancestors of their families. They wrote on oracle bones made of turtle shells. Then the Zhou dynasty took over. The Zhou was mainly a feudalistic time period. This dynasty rose due to the mandate of heaven, which is basically when God picks their favorite guy. The iron and soybean economies grew dramatically, and they used money to expand their commerce. They also made the first book, called the Book of Songs. After a while, China began to believe in Hinduism. They believed that God is one and known by many names, and that the universe is part of the unchanging and all-powerful spirit called the Brahman. They read sacred texts and focus on the essential self. Their main goal is moksha, or union with the Brahman, that takes many lifetimes to achieve. They also believe in karma and dharma. China also believed in Confucius's ideas. He was a philosopher, and he never wrote down his ideas. He believed in the 5 key relationships, and he told the emperors how to emperor. Let's check on the Indus River Valley civilization.
Oh yeah, they're gone.
They are replaced by India, and it's being ruled by Chandragupta. His India included northern India down to the Deccan, and his rule was effective but harsh. Asoka was the grandson of Chandragupta. He was one of the most honored rulers of India, and he conquered the Deccan through harsh, bloody wars. He was so horrified that he converted to Buddhism and rejected violence. He set up the 5 pillars for his people to follow. Buddhism was founded by Gautama Buddha, the enlightened one, who sat under a tree and discovered how not to be sad. The Guptas invented decimals and made murals. They created the caste system, which was a social class system based on Hindu beliefs. The lowest of these people were the untouchables, who had to signal their approach with a wooden clapper so people could avoid them.
Pretty much current mood.
Greek civilization was centered around Crete, and they were originally known as the Minoans and built their culture and ideas on technology from Mesopotamia. But they did some original stuff too, like using columns in their architecture and sculpting people into stiff positions. They had philosophers who were experts at talking like fancy people. But then Socrates the hipster was all like, "Why do we have to master the art of speaking? Can't we just pose questions like philosophers should instead of that?" But then they killed him. Greece fought a war with Troy called the Trojan War for 10 years. Though Greece was isolated by mountains and valleys, they had links to the outside world through sea routes. They often returned with grains, metals, and ideas, like the Phoenician alphabet, which they expanded. The population became so big that people had to leave, and they spread the Greek culture from Spain to Egypt. Their leader, Philip II, wanted to conquer the Persian Empire, but died before he could do so. Then his son Alex did it. He was pretty great. He spread the Greek culture across the area, and he never lost a battle, except for his battle with the fever. One person could not take his place, so the empire was split into thirds. The 2 most powerful city-states were polar opposites, and they were Sparta and Athens. They were both polytheistic and believed their gods lived on Mount Olympus. Darius I got jealous of Greece, so he asked them for gifts. Athens and Sparta both said no, so Darius started the Peloponnesian Wars. The Greeks won, and Darius I became so mad that he challenged them again and sent a giant wave of soldiers. After 27 years of fighting the Peloponnesian War, it engulfed the Greeks. The Etruscans had ruled Rome until 509 BC. Then that year they established a republic. They made sure individuals would not gain too much power by forming the Senate. The Senate was made of the upper class, but plebeians wanted to know what all the laws they were making were, so the Senate released 12 tables. The family was the basic unit of society in Rome. Women had more rights in Rome than in Greece, but their religion was very similar to the Greeks. Everyone knew how to read and write, and the army was spread across Italy, but they treated their conquered people with justice. Rome had expanded its territories, and Carthage got mad. They fought the Punic Wars, and by the third, Carthage was completely destroyed. They devoured the Mediterranean Sea and set up many Roman commerces. They were very wealthy, and this increased their corruption, so they had many civil wars. But out of the chaos emerged Julius Caesar. He conquered France and crushed the civil wars. He forced the Senate to make him dictator, but they thought he wanted to become king of Rome. He was then assassinated, or tossed.
Because he was a salad.
Octavian, his grandnephew, became the King Augustus, who ruled until AD 14. He reformed the government, ordered a census, created the postal service, and his government lasted for 200 years. It was like a golden age. In around 4 BC, a man named Jesus was born. He preached Jewish ideas with ideas of his own, and he preached that if you believed in him, you would receive salvation. Judas then betrayed him, and he was crucified. The Roman government hated Christianity, but it still spread. This caused many people to become martyrs. After the death of Marcus Aurelius, Pax Romana ended, and for the next 100 years, chaos ensued. But in 1312, Constantine gained the throne. He allowed people to love Jesus and built a new capital called Constantinople. In 221 BC, Shi Huangdi wanted to reunite China. He used brutal methods that brought about China's classical age. He brought about the legalist ideology, conquered many states, abolished feudalism, and made many military states. Gave land to the peasants, but the peasants still had to pay high taxes. Anyone who opposed him was killed. He joined the Great Wall, which did not stop invaders, but instead became a symbol of China's unity. Emperor Wudi was one of the most famous emperors of his time. He reigned for 50 years, and he strengthened the economy and the government. Improved roads, had a monopoly on salt, had an expressionist way of thinking, loved Confucius ideas, and created the civil service exam. It was a golden age of China. When the Han Dynasty ended, China remained divided for 400 years, but then Yi Wang became the emperor, and the Tang Dynasty took over. Vietnam, Tibet, and Korea became tributary states to China, and the peasants owned their land. They still had to pay high taxes, but this paid for the Grand Canal that linked the two rivers. The Song Dynasty began in 960. It had less land than the Tang, and they were always invaded by invaders, but it was still a golden age of China. This was the capital built by Constantine during the fall of the Roman Empire. Constantinople was the strait that connected the Black and Mediterranean seas. It was one of the most powerful cities in the world until they tried to defeat the Visigoths after 100 years of staying together. Then they were defeated. The Huns were also attacking all of Europe, and the Germans fled to Rome, and then that was the fall of Rome. The Byzantine Empire had a great harbor guarded on 3 sides by ocean. Their emperors lived in glorious splendor, but its spectacular power soon declined quickly. But it lived as a small empire for 1,000 years. One emperor of the Byzantines was named Justinian. He conquered many areas, built the Hagia Sophia, but was best remembered for his set of laws, Justinian's Code. His empire spread through Western Europe, and the Roman Catholic Church even modeled his laws. He was an autocrat with absolute power. Speaking of the church, they now sell 2 brands of Catholicism. Muhammad was a merchant who was tired of people becoming idols, so he went to a cave to meditate. He then heard the voice of the angel Gabriel, who tells him about the true God. He then preaches the religion of Islam. Islam is a monotheistic religion, with the sacred texts of the Quran. They gather in mosques without priests, and they believe that each individual will face Allah on Judgment Day to burn or thrive. After Muhammad died, they had a hard time deciding who would succeed him, causing a schism. Japan is an archipelago, or a group of islands.
The seas protect and the seas attack.
The seas also serve as trade routes for the Japanese. Early Japanese society was divided into clans. Their language is based on Korean, but completely different from Chinese. But Japan liked Chinese culture, and they used Chinese writing, but they added their own writing, like kana. In 1192, the first shogun was appointed, and 3 military dynasties ruled Japan. Their soldiers were called samurai, who took an oath of Bushido, and they practiced Zen Buddhism. Russia was full of rivers, so they were able to trade with many countries. The Slavs had expanded into southern Russia, and the Vikings also moved in during the 700s and 800s. Knock knock, who is it this time? It's the Christian missionaries who have come to convert Russia to Catholicism. But then in 1236 to 1241, the Mongols attacked Russia and ruled over them for 240 years. They were fierce but tolerant. After the Mongol power declined, they faced the Golden Horde at the Battle of Kulakova. Ivan the Great ruled from 1462 to 1505, who took the title of Tsar. His grandson was Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible centralized the government and tied the serfs to the land. However, he was mentally unstable, and when he died, he left his land in a rebellion. The Mongols were originally nomads who conquered many lands and became a very large empire. Their first leader was Genghis Khan, who used strict military discipline and started to expand his empire, but his heirs finished that. He ruled his lands with justice and toleration. They had a period of peace and prosperity called Pax Mongolia before collapsing. Marco Polo visited them during the Han Dynasty in China and described their beautiful palaces and efficient systems. He brought his writings back to Europe. It's the 1300s, and Italy is pretty rich. Florence became a symbol of the Renaissance. Then the Medici family took over the government because they were rich, and they could. And they wanted to make the Renaissance great again. They were a patron to the arts and controlled the media. The Renaissance had a more humanistic mindset than past golden ages. Leonardo da Vinci, was a Renaissance genius. He had an interest in invention, painting, anatomy, and other sciences. He painted the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. Michelangelo sculpted the Pietà and the sculpture of David. He also painted the ceiling on the Sistine Chapel.
Also, he's my favorite turtle.
Raphael was most famous for his portrayal of the Madonna. There were also many Renaissance writers, including Castiglione, Machiavelli, and Shakespeare. Gutenberg also invented the printing press, and he printed the first complete Bible. Hey, are you scared of hell? Buy indulgences! Martin Luther was furious at this. He wrote the 95 Thesis and distributed it all over Europe. The church wanted him to recant, but the people were already on his side, even after he was excommunicated. Martin believed in faith alone achieving salvation. Other thinkers added to his ideas, such as Calvin, who believed in predestination. Pope Paul III thought that something ought to be done. He then called the Council of Trent to reform the church, reaffirm tradition, and establish the Jesuits. There were many intellectual discoveries made in Europe as well, with many thinkers abandoning spiritual thinking and thought more logically. Like with Copernicus's heliocentric model of the solar system, it went against the teachings of the church and taught purely logically. Galileo went against the teachings of the church as well, but was forced to recant his ideas. Descartes invented the scientific method, and it's still used today. And finally, Newton discovered gravity and purely used logic for his writings and other discoveries.
Is that it? Did we cover everything? Okay, I think we're good.